Hello, everyone. So today we are going to look a little bit more at data analysis, the results in the discussion section, particularly when you collect qualitative data, because the bottom line is that the majority of our students, when they are completing their thesis or their final project, they are collecting data that is qualitative. And so, of course, what we mean by that is we're collecting data in the form of words versus in the form of numbers. So we're gonna basically zero in on that a little bit more for this lecture. So there are several different ways that you can analyze qualitative data. Uh, you can actually use design thinking strategies to really help you with analyzing of data for sure. I'll go over one design thinking strategy, but I think there's other ways too that you could use design thinking strategies to analyze the data. So one is certainly we can use affinity clustering. So with affinity clustering, what we could do is, let's say that you have interview data. Okay, so you have interviewed your participants. When you interviewed your participants, you recorded them on Zoom. And when you were interviewing, of course, your questions, you have all of this data, all of this open-ended data or qualitative data. Your data is all in the form of words. So Zoom will give you a transcript of the interview. And what's great about that is that means you've recorded, you then have a transcript of the data. That really tends to increase the reliability of the data by having that transcript. So what you could do is you could print that transcript out and you could read through the responses of your interviewees. You could take all the interview responses, read through them several times. I usually recommend that you read through them 3 times. And then what you'll start to notice is you'll see common themes. And so you can write those common themes. In other words, maybe there's common words that are repeated. You would write those on a sticky note. Or maybe there are common phrases that are repeated, and you would write those on a sticky note. And then what you would do is you would start to cluster those themes or those words or phrases into common themes or categories, which is what we do with affinity clustering. So the one thing you do have to think about, though, is with qualitative data is that the reliability is always an issue. And so what I mean by that is if just you, the student researcher, takes the transcripts from the interviews, and then if you read through them by yourself, you determine the common words and common phrases by yourself, and then you do that affinity cluster and you take those words and those phrases and you cluster them into themes, okay, or categories, and you do that all on your own. The question becomes, how reliable is that data? And the reason why people might question that is because you're the student researcher, you're very close to the study, you're collecting the data, and sometimes, whether we like it or not, we can be biased in terms of how we interpret the data. So what you could do is you can get another person. So for example, you could get the chair of your committee to read through and then determine, use affinity clustering. Again, go through the data, come up with their phrases and words, and then use affinity clustering to categorize those phrases and words into themes. You would then compare your results. This is called inter-rater reliability. And again, what it's looking at is how reliable is the data that you analyzed. So clearly we can use design thinking strategies. And one that a lot of our students will use is affinity clustering. But you might think of other ways that you can use design thinking strategies when you're analyzing your data. We can also use what's called content analysis. And to be honest with you, content analysis in many respects is similar to affinity clustering. So again, you read through the open-ended responses and you got to familiarize yourself with the data. So when you're reading through open-ended responses, so for example, it could be open-ended responses from interviews. This could be open-ended responses from a questionnaire. you need to read through them several times. You can't just read through it once. You want to read through this data several times because as you start to familiarize yourself with this data, again, you're going to see repetition in some of the responses. So then you identify a coding unit. So a coding unit, again, very similar to affinity clustering, in that coding unit could be maybe you're seeing a certain phrase that is repeated throughout those open-ended responses or a particular word. That becomes your coding unit, and then you apply it to your data analysis. And so what you'll do then is you'll start to tally. How many times do I see this particular word while I'm reading through the open-ended responses? How many times do I see this particular phrase? So again, very similar to affinity clustering. Here, though, what you're doing is, yes, you're analyzing qualitative data, but now you're also looking at frequencies. How many times am I seeing that within the qualitative data? As I mentioned, Zoom transcripts are very helpful because they will give you the exact wording of what your participants said, particularly if you're interviewing. You could also get Zoom transcripts of if you're doing a design thinking workshop as well, okay? Audio recording, again, increases the reliability, but also consider, again, how you can really improve reliability by having two separate people look at the qualitative data and then comparing the results. That, again, is called inter-rater reliability. We also have, as I mentioned, we have the Smart Lab. And the Smart Lab is a lab on campus that will help you with data analysis. So it's very easy to use the Smart Lab. You just basically request an appointment with them, and they will help you with analyzing data that you might have from a questionnaire, could be data from interviews, could be data from your design thinking workshops. We have, first of all, we have a software package. It's called NVivo. And NVivo, again, is available through the Smart Lab. It, again, allows you to code and theme qualitative data. Okay. Again, it's similar to affinity clustering, similar to content analysis. You're basically doing that with a software package. Some researchers are actually starting to use ChatGPT or AI for coding of qualitative data. And again, the Smart Lab can help you with this. I have a student right now who called the Smart Lab. The Smart Lab basically told her out how to input her interview data into ChatGPT and kind of showed her the coding that she could use so that ChatGPT would then come up with the common themes and categories from her interview data. So again, just remember that the Smart Lab is a really great resource, and you can also use them for help with analyzing qualitative data. Okay, so once you get your data analyzed, you then have to write it up, okay? And so basically the last two chapters, and when I talk about the last two chapters here, I am talking about the last two chapters for the thesis. The last two chapters for a final project are going to differ. And that's something that you would certainly need to talk with your chair about if you opt to do a final project. So, but let's kind of go back to the thesis option. And the first thing you need to do, and students often forget to do this, is you've got to tell us about your sample. So what I mean by that is in the method you described who your sample will be, okay? In the results, you need to basically explain who it ended up being, okay? So for example, if you send out, let's say you decide to do part of your data analysis would be a questionnaire. So what we would want to know is who responded to the questionnaire, how many responses did you get, how many did you send out, how many responses did you get, what was your response rate, okay? Then we want to know some demographic information about that sample. What is their, for example, what is their mean age? What gender? What's the percentage of gender that responded? If you asked questions related to ethnicity or race, we would want to know that. If there are other important demographic questions that you asked, you need to give that information. You need to describe the sample, okay? That's one of the first things you do. So maybe, for example, if your data collection happens in phases, okay, then use your results and describe those phases. So for example, if phase 1 was a questionnaire, describe the results from the questionnaire. Start with the sample, okay? If phase 2 is interviews, again, describe who you interviewed, who responded to the interviews, looking at demographic information. We interviewed 10 people. These 10 people, the mean age of these 10 people was okay? Then maybe the last phase was a workshop. Describe the workshop. Again, who participated in the workshop? How many people participated in the workshop? Then start to describe the results or your data analysis. The key here is the results or the findings. That's it, okay? Most people, when they're writing these, they do 2 separate chapters. They have the results and then they have discussion. Occasionally, students will combine it. You'll see this is a student example I'm showing on this slide. And the results and discussion for this particular student thesis were combined, but you'll notice he did it by phase. Typically, students, though, will write the results, which is just the findings, okay? That's chapter 4, and then chapter 5 is the discussion, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So here's an example of some results. First of all, you're going to see on the left, okay, is a table that describes the participants, okay? So in some cases, you may need to do that, particularly if you have a larger sample. On the right, we basically see, first of all, we see the data analysis explained. This happens in the methods, okay? So in the methods, you're going to describe how you are analyzing the data. And then you're going to see in this particular article, the results and the discussion were combined, okay? You're going to notice, first of all, we described the sample. The men we interviewed ranged in age from 25 to 56 years old and had been homeless 1 to 5 years. 2 of the men were African American and the other 4 were Caucasian. The names of the participants have been changed to protect identities. Okay. Then we're going to start to describe, you can see we're describing the results here. And we look at, first of all, these were the themes that were derived from our interviews. And so we kind of organize this according to themes, okay? So it kind of depends on what you're doing with your study. Some students will organize this according to phase. So in the last slide I showed you, it was phase 1, the questionnaire. He's going to explain the results for the questionnaire. You might then explain the results from the design thinking workshop. Okay, so use headings in the results. And again, typically the results are just the findings, okay? Sometimes students will combine it. Typically they don't, though. I hope that makes sense. So then you describe the findings. If you have questionnaire data, remind people of the questionnaire. You can use Qualtrics to give you frequencies, means. You can also include graphs, okay? And so you're going to see here in this case, the student is describing the results. He provides figures. It gives us percentages that are coming from his questionnaire. Interview data, you're going to give us the themes, okay? The themes could be from affinity clustering. It could be from content analysis. It could be from using NVivo, but you need to provide us with the themes, how the themes were derived. That's in the data analysis section of the methods. You also need to give us actual quotes. It's really important that you are transparent with your findings. So what I mean by that is if you interview people, you need to give quotes that illustrate the themes that are coming out of the data analysis. Those quotes will allow us to, that it will give more transparency to the themes that have been derived, okay? And you kind of saw that. I'm going to go to the previous slide. Here you're going to see, like, you'll see here the theme is mobility, dignity, and size. And then you're going to see that we have a quote here. It says, "We cannot leave belongings in mission 1. We have to take items with us." That relates to this idea of mobility. They have to take their items with them. So again, you want to show quotes that basically reiterate the themes. Here we have a quote. "I believe the biggest flaw is its size. It needs to be more lightweight and smaller." That has to do with size. okay? Uh, and again, here's kind of, I'm just sort of reiterating that here. It says, most people who are homeless have their whole life with them. 80% will not carry a shelter around with them. They will hide it. They have other items to carry. So again, that has to do, first of all, with mobility. Okay. That's a mobility theme, meaning they're not going to carry this homeless shelter on their back, which we thought was such a great idea for this particular study. They're saying, no, we won't do it. It's too big. Most people are carrying backpacks with them who are homeless. They're not going to carry the shelter. So that has to do with that mobility theme. Okay. Another thing you can do is, again, be really transparent, which I just talked about. Include quotes from your interviews, illustrate how that quote relates to the theme that was derived through your data analysis. If you're doing design thinking workshops, and many of you will, have a figure of those design thinking strategies. Show the data. So, for example, this was a stakeholder map that was conducted by the participants. And so the student researcher is showing the stakeholder map. He's explaining basically what he found in the stakeholder map. This was what the participants came up with the stakeholder map. Again, be transparent. Explain the design thinking strategy you used, explain what you found from the design thinking strategy, and include figures. Really important to do that. And I think these next few slides show that. So for example, this is a slide that he was using to show affinity clustering of the stakeholder map. So basically the stakeholder map was taken and then the stakeholders were put into particular themes. And you can see those here, and he's very transparent with how those themes were derived. This is a what's on your radar that was done in one of the workshops. And again, what he's showing is this is from the participants. Okay, so he's showing the radar screen. He's then going to talk about the radar screen. What did the participants put in the center of that? What was most important to them related to people, programs, etc. Okay. Okay, so let me just kind of reiterate here or repeat. The results are the findings of the study. You're basically talking about here is what we found. Okay. You want to make sure that you just talk about the findings in that results chapter. You want to make sure that you are transparent in your findings. You should include figures. You need to make sure when you are talking about the results, how that relates back to the data analysis. So what I mean by that is if you say we used affinity clustering to determine the themes, okay, in the interview data, you need to be transparent. What are those themes? Use them as headings if you need to. Then have quotes from the interviews that reiterate those themes. That's really important. With questionnaire data, easy to do because you can use Qualtrics. You can show graphs that illustrate percentages, graphs that illustrate means. Give the question. 54% said we strongly agreed with okay? And with the design thinking workshops, again, same idea. Show us figures. If they did a bullseye diagram, show the bullseye diagram, talk about what was clustered in the center of that bullseye diagram. So once you get the results done, the next and last chapter in the thesis is the discussion. I always feel like the discussion is kind of hard to write. It's the last chapter. By that point, you might be getting a little tired of working on your thesis, but I think it's one of the most important sections of the thesis because this is basically where you are going to talk about what do the results mean? What do the results mean in relationship to the literature review? This is where you're going to look at, here's my findings. Here's how I either agree or disagree with what is noted in the literature review. So finding A may agree with the literature review, but finding B may disagree. This is so important because this is how you show how you're moving the body of knowledge forward. Again, this is not an easy part to write. I think it's one of the more difficult ones, but it's really important. It must have citations because it's relating back to the literature review. Really, what I would do with this is I would print out your literature review. I would have it right beside you. I would be looking at my literature review, looking at my findings, and look at the connections. Okay, because that's really what has to happen here. The discussion relates back to the literature review. So as you read through journal articles, you're doing that. You are reading through journal articles for your literature review. Start to notice how they're organized. Pay attention to how the results are written. Pay attention to how the discussion is written, because that's going to help you with your thesis. The discussion also has the limitations, and then you end with conclusions. And you're going to see, for example, if you start to look at this right here, this is pulled from an article. It's a qualitative study. It's posted on D2L. And you're going to notice, first of all, look at the references. This is the discussion section. And you're going to see all these references. These are references that are taken from the literature review. Okay, very important. You're going to see towards the end of the discussion that we talk about the limitations. Remember, the limitations are the weaknesses of the study, okay? And so you need to call those out. All studies have weaknesses, okay? And so it's really important that you call out what are those. Maybe you had a really small sample size. We did in this study, our sample size was very small, okay? That is clearly a limitation. Our maybe you used a convenience sample. That's another limitation. Maybe you found some limitations with your interview questions that participants maybe weren't as clear as you thought they would be. So you want to call those things out. It's really important because that then leads to future research on down the road. So just to kind of provide you with the review, again, remember that we're always writing in an hourglass format. The introduction starts broad, and we get more and more specific as we write. The literature review starts broad, but the literature review will get more specific. The purpose, a lot of times, can come at the end of the introduction. What's important to note is that the purpose, in many respects, relates to the results. Okay, remember, you are collecting data to fulfill the purpose or the aim of your study. So look at what those variables are, and you may be able to organize your results according to that purpose. You may be able to organize your results according to the phases of your study. But remember, the results are the findings, okay? The literature review relates to the discussion. This is really important. There's a very strong tie between the literature review and the discussion. The discussion talks about how your findings either agree with the literature review or disagree with the literature review. And then the introduction and the conclusion relate because now you're going broader out, okay? So when you write your conclusions, look at what you said in your introduction. When you write your discussion, look at what you said in your literature review. So there's a lot of connections that are happening in this thesis that these are, to be honest with you, common problems that I see when I read manuscripts. When I was the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Interior Design, these are the problems that I see all the time. There may not be any relationship between the literature review and the discussion. Or what might happen is that the results don't relate to the purpose at all. Like there might be new variables that are introduced in the results or in the methods too. So I'm always looking for those connections in a paper. So I hope this helped in terms of providing more information on how you might analyze data, how you write the results, how you write the discussion section. Again, really pay attention to this as you are reading journal articles, because in many respects, your thesis is like a journal article. It's just longer, okay? And if you have any questions, by all means, please always let me know. I'm more than willing to meet with you on Zoom or talk with you if you do have any questions.